Haarlem, Netherlands. Spring 1943. A young girl with dark braids cycled slowly past a German checkpoint on a quiet Tuesday morning, her bicycle basket covered with a cheerful cloth. The Nazi guards barely glanced at her. She looked perhaps 12 years old, innocent and harmless. What they couldn't see were the firearms hidden beneath that cloth, or the fact that this child had already killed multiple German soldiers and Dutch traitors. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen, and at 14 years old, she had become one of the most effective assassins in the Dutch resistance. The story of how a barely teenage girl became a trained killer begins not with violence, but with compassion. Born on September 6, 1925, in the village of Schoten, just outside Haarlem, Freddie grew up on a barge with her parents and older sister, Truus. Life on the barge was cramped, but filled with the sounds of water lapping against the hull. The family struggled financially, living on the edge of poverty, barely scraping together enough for food and clothes. When her parents divorced, their world contracted further. Their mother moved the girls into a cramped apartment in Haarlem where they slept on straw mattresses. The rooms were small, the winters cold. Most families in their position would have focused solely on survival. But the Oversteegen mother was not most people. Despite having almost nothing, she opened their home to refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Jewish families escaping Germany, political dissidents running from Hitler's expanding reach. This was no ordinary mother. She was a dedicated communist with a fierce moral compass and an unshakable belief in fighting injustice. While other families looked the other way, afraid of drawing attention, afraid of the consequences, the Oversteegen mother made their tiny apartment a sanctuary. Throughout the 1930s, as Hitler's shadow lengthened across Europe, she hid Jewish refugees from Germany in their small home. She hid people from Lithuania in the hold of their barge when they still lived on the water. She taught her daughters through action, not words, a lesson that would define their lives. When people need help, you make sacrifices. When evil comes, you don't look away. You resist. May 10th, 1940 changed everything forever. German forces launched their invasion of the Netherlands with devastating speed and precision. The Blitzkrieg was merciless. Within 5 days, Rotterdam lay in ruins, bombed into submission. Within 7 days, the entire country was under Nazi occupation. Freddie was 14 years old. Truus was 16. Their childhood ended that week. The occupation began with deceptive normalcy. German soldiers walked the streets of Haarlem, their boots echoing on cobblestones that had known only peace. But the terror came quickly. Freddie would later recall the sounds that haunted her nights. The banging on doors with rifle butts. The yelling that echoed through entire neighborhoods. The sight of Jewish families dragged from their homes. I remember how people were taken from their homes, Freddie told an interviewer decades later. The Germans were banging on doors with the butts of their rifles. That made so much noise, you'd hear it in the entire neighborhood. And they would always yell. It was very frightening. The Oversteegen family didn't adapt. They resisted. Freddie and Truus began distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets on the streets of Haarlem. They glued warnings across German posters, calling for Dutch men to work in Germany. "Don't go to Germany," their messages read. For every Dutch man working in Germany, a German man will go to the front. Then they would hurry off on their bicycles before Nazi patrols could catch them. This dangerous work attracted attention. Not from the Nazis, but from Franz van der Wiel, commander of the Haarlem Council of Resistance. One day in 1941, he knocked on the Oversteegen door. He spoke directly to their mother. Would she permit her daughters to join the resistance? They were young, innocent-looking. No one would suspect them. They could be invaluable. Their mother gave her consent with one condition, one absolute requirement that she made the girls promise. Always stay human. Neither the girls nor their mother understood what Franz van der Wiel truly had in mind. Freddie thought they were joining a secret army. She imagined training, military discipline, marching in formation. The reality would be far more brutal. After the girls agreed to join, Franz revealed the truth. They would sabotage bridges and railway lines. They would transport Jewish refugees to safe houses. And they would learn to shoot Nazis. Truus remembered her sister's response to this revelation. I remember my sister saying, "Well, that's something I've never done before." The training took place in a potato shed outside Haarlem. 7 resistance fighters gathered there, Freddie and Truus the only females. Someone taught them to handle weapons, to load, aim, and fire, to kill without hesitation. They practiced shooting in the woods where the sound of gunfire would be mistaken for hunters. They learned to march silently, to move without being seen. But weapons training was only part of their preparation. They learned to use their greatest advantage, their appearance. Freddie was small for her age. When she wore her hair in 2 long braids, she looked even younger than 14. She looked like a child, harmless, innocent, incapable of violence. This was precisely what made her lethal. Their first mission was arson. The 2 sisters approached a Nazi-occupied warehouse in Haarlem on a crisp evening in 1941. German SS guards stood at the entrance, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders, confident in their authority. They were the occupiers. They were in control. 2 young Dutch girls approaching them were nothing to worry about. Freddie and Truus smiled at the guards, flirted innocently, played the role of young girls, fascinated by the soldiers in their sharp uniforms. They asked questions about Germany, about the soldiers' homes, about anything that would keep the guards' attention focused on them and away from the shadows. While the guards were distracted, other resistance fighters slipped past and set the building ablaze. Flames erupted from the warehouse, consuming Nazi supplies. 2 warehouses burned that night, lighting up the Haarlem sky. The Germans launched an investigation. They rounded up suspects. They interrogated civilians. They never suspected the girls who had smiled at their guards. The success of that mission led to more dangerous work. Railway sabotage became routine, though routine is perhaps the wrong word for work, where a single mistake meant execution. Freddie and Truus would plant explosives on the line between Ijmuiden and Haarlem, timing their attacks for maximum disruption of German supply movements. They learned to work quickly in the darkness, their hands steady despite the fear, knowing that Nazi patrols could appear at any moment. They smuggled Jewish children to hiding places across the Netherlands, cycling for hours with frightened kids hidden in their bicycle baskets or riding on their handlebars. They even helped break children out of concentration camps. an operation so dangerous that discovery meant immediate execution, not just for them, but for everyone involved. They forged identification papers, created false histories, turned Jewish children into Christian orphans on paper so they could survive in plain sight. But Frans van der Wiel had a darker purpose in mind for these innocent-looking young women. By Truus's account, Freddie became the first to carry out what they called a liquidation, an assassination. The target was a Dutch woman, a collaborator who was preparing to hand over lists of Jewish people to the Germans. Hundreds would die if she succeeded. The resistance decided she had to be stopped. Freddie was given the assignment. She approached the woman in a park in Haarlem. The target was walking alone, unsuspecting. Freddie, with her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst, asked the woman for her name, just to confirm she had the right target. The woman answered. Freddie drew her weapon and fired. The woman fell. Freddie fled. Later, she would describe the strange compulsion she felt at that moment, the human impulse to help someone who has fallen. "Yes, I've shot a gun myself and I've seen them fall," she said in an interview. And what is inside us at such a moment? You want to help them get up. This internal conflict, the battle between the soldier who must kill and the human who wants to help, would haunt Freddie for the rest of her life. But there was no time for reflection. The resistance needed her. The war continued. More missions followed. Freddie and Truus developed a deadly efficiency that came from practice and necessity. Their most common technique was the bicycle drive-by, a method that sounds almost absurd until you understand its brutal effectiveness. Truus would pedal while Freddie sat on the back of the bicycle, her small frame making them look like two sisters on a casual ride through the city. Nothing threatening, nothing suspicious. As they approached a German soldier or Dutch collaborator, Freddie would scan the area with practiced eyes. No witnesses, no other soldiers, no escape routes for the target. She would make sure the coast was clear, her heart hammering, but her hands steady. Then she would draw her weapon from beneath her coat or from the bicycle basket and fire. The shot would crack through the street. The target would fall, and the bicycle never stopped moving. Truus would pedal harder, and they would disappear around a corner before anyone could react. By the time witnesses realized what had happened, by the time someone thought to chase them, the girls were gone. Two innocent-looking teenagers on a bicycle among hundreds of others in the city. "We always went by bike, never walked," Truus explained years later. "That was too dangerous. I always made sure the coast was clear. That worked very well." But the technique that would make them infamous was far more intimate and disturbing. The honey trap, the seduction assassination. A resistance fighter, usually Freddie or Truus, would enter a tavern or bar frequented by German soldiers or Dutch SS collaborators. She would flirt with a target, smile, laugh, play the innocent young girl impressed by a man in uniform. Then she would ask if he wanted to go for a walk, a stroll in the woods, perhaps a romantic encounter away from prying eyes. The men always said yes. They followed these young girls into the forests outside Haarlem. They never came back. The mechanics varied. Sometimes the girl who had lured the target would shoot him herself. Sometimes another resistance fighter waited in the woods to carry out the execution. Sometimes both sisters worked together, one as bait and one as executioner. The resistance kept careful records of Nazi officers and Dutch traitors who posed the greatest threat to Jewish refugees and resistance operations. These men were marked for death. How many did Freddie kill? We will never know. When asked, she gave the same answer every time. You shouldn't ask a soldier how many people he shot. She was a soldier. Soldiers don't tell. In 1943, the resistance cell gained a third female member. Hannie Schaft was a former law student with brilliant red hair and fierce intelligence. She had dropped out of university rather than sign a loyalty pledge to Nazi Germany. Freddie admitted years later that she was initially jealous of Hannie. The novelty of being the only young woman in the resistance was diminished by her arrival. But jealousy gave way to friendship, and eventually to something deeper. Hannie became like a sister to Freddie and Truus. The three young women formed a specialized assassination unit. Hannie was the intellectual, analyzing targets and planning operations. Truus was the decisive leader, making the hard calls when hesitation meant death. Freddie was the planner and lookout, mapping escape routes and ensuring they were never caught off guard. Together, they were extraordinarily effective. They gathered intelligence on German troop movements. They sabotaged bridges and rail lines. They smuggled weapons. They even planted a communist flag at the headquarters of the Dutch National Socialist movement. A bold middle finger to Nazi authority. But the psychological cost was devastating. These were not hardened soldiers. They were teenagers forced into a war they hadn't started. Freddie was barely 16 when she killed her first victim. The trauma accumulated with every mission, every shot fired, every body that fell. It was tragic and very difficult, and we cried about it afterwards, Truus remembered. We did not feel it suited us. It never suits anybody, unless they are real criminals. One loses everything. It poisons the beautiful things in life. The poison was insomnia, nightmares, depression, the inability to forget the faces of the men they had killed. Some were evil, SS officers who had murdered Dutch civilians, collaborators who had sent Jewish families to death camps. But knowing your victim deserved to die doesn't make killing them easier. The trauma remained. There was one mission Freddie refused. The resistance received intelligence about a Nazi officer traveling with his young children. The order came down. Liquidate him. Take out the entire family if necessary. Freddie, Truus, and Hannie refused. We are no Hitlerites, Freddie told an interviewer decades later. Resistance fighters don't murder children. Throughout the war, the three women were never captured. Their youthful appearance, their careful planning, and their absolute commitment to the cause kept them alive. But they couldn't save everyone. March 21st, 1945. 3 weeks before the war's end. Hannie Schaft was arrested at a military checkpoint in Haarlem. She was transporting illegal communist newspapers and carrying a pistol. The Nazis had been hunting her for months. They knew her only as the girl with the red hair. Now they had her. The interrogation was brutal. Torture. Demands for names of other resistance fighters. Hannie gave them nothing. On April 17, 1945, she was taken to the dunes near Bloemendaal. A German firing squad waited. The first shot only wounded her. According to legend, her last words were, "I'm a better shot." Freddie and Truus didn't learn of Hannie's death until after the liberation in May 1945. They had waited at the reception point for liberated Dutch prisoners, expecting to welcome their friend home. Instead, they learned she had been dead for weeks. The grief was overwhelming. They had survived the war. Hannie had not. The psychological scars of those years never truly healed. How could they? Freddie had killed her first victim at 14. She had watched men fall, fought the impulse to help them, and learned to live with the weight of those deaths. After the war ended in May 1945, Truus became a sculptor and painter, processing her trauma through art. She spoke publicly about the resistance, gave lectures at schools and universities, wrote a memoir titled Not Then, Not Now, Not Ever. She confronted her past by talking about it, by keeping the memory of what they did and why they did it alive. Freddie chose a different path entirely. I coped by getting married and having babies. She told an interviewer with characteristic directness. She married John Decker, a steelworker at the Hoogovens Company, and took his name. She raised 3 children, focusing her energy on creating the normal, peaceful life she'd been denied as a teenager. She rarely spoke of the war years. When people asked, she deflected. She changed the subject. She built walls around those memories because looking at them directly was too painful. But the insomnia persisted, a nightly reminder that some wounds never close. The nightmares came regularly, vivid reenactments of missions gone wrong, of faces she'd never forget. Every year on May 4th, Remembrance Day in the Netherlands, when the entire country paused to honor the war dead, she woke with a feeling of dread that wouldn't lift. The day was meant to honor sacrifice, but for Freddie it was a reminder of the price she'd paid and continued to pay. For decades, the Dutch government largely ignored the Oversteegen sisters' contributions. They were communists, which made them politically inconvenient in Cold War Europe. They were women, which made their violent resistance work uncomfortable for a society that preferred its female heroes to have been nurses or smugglers, not assassins. Recognition finally came in 2014. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte awarded Freddie and Truus the Mobilization War Cross, a military honor for wartime service. Streets in Haarlem were named after them. The world finally acknowledged what they had done. Freddie's son Remy described that ceremony as a highlight of his mother's life. After 7 decades of silence, her country finally recognized her service, finally honored her courage. But Freddie never glorified what she had done. In interviews during her final years, she spoke carefully about the moral complexity of killing, even killing Nazis. She described herself as a soldier, not a hero. She insisted on the distinction. Soldiers do what must be done in war. That doesn't make them heroes. That makes them survivors who carry the weight of their actions. On September 5th, 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday, Freddie Oversteegen died in a nursing home in Driehuis. Truus had died 2 years earlier, also at age 92. Both women lived long lives, but neither ever fully escaped the shadows of the war. The story of Freddie Oversteegen challenges our comfortable narratives about World War II. We prefer our resistance heroes to be older, male, and operating in ways that don't force us to confront the intimate horror of warfare. We prefer clean stories of sabotage and intelligence gathering. The image of a 14-year-old girl shooting a man in the head, watching him fall, fighting the human impulse to help him up. That image is deeply uncomfortable. But it is also deeply true. Freddie Oversteegen was not a superhero. She was not an action movie character. She was a child forced by circumstances to become a killer. She did terrible things to terrible people. She saved lives by taking lives. She lived with the psychological consequences for 7 decades. What makes her story remarkable is not that she killed Nazis. Many resistance fighters did. What makes her story remarkable is that she did so while maintaining her humanity. Her mother's instruction to always stay human was not just a plea. It was a survival strategy. Freddie and Truus killed when killing was necessary. They refused to kill children when ordered. They wept after every assassination. They spent the rest of their lives processing the trauma of what they had done. The mathematics of resistance are brutal. If that Dutch collaborator had delivered her list of Jewish families to the Germans, hundreds would have died. By killing one, Freddie saved many. If those SS officers had continued their work, more civilians would have been murdered. By killing them, the resistance disrupted Nazi operations and saved Dutch lives. But mathematics don't erase trauma. Necessity doesn't prevent nightmares. Freddie Oversteegen did what she believed was right in an impossible situation. She paid for those choices with decades of insomnia and grief. Today, her story is finally being told. Books have been written about the 3 young women of the Dutch resistance. Streets bear their names. School children learn about their courage. But Freddie would probably have preferred to remain unknown. She never sought glory. She sought only to do what was necessary to stop evil. In the end, the girl with braids who cycled through Haarlem with weapons in her basket became one of the most effective resistance fighters in occupied Netherlands. She killed Nazis. She saved Jews. She survived when survival seemed impossible. And she carried the weight of those years until her final breath. The story of Freddie Oversteegen is not a comfortable story. It's a story about a child forced into war, about impossible choices made in impossible circumstances, about the cost of resistance and the price of survival. It's a story that should never have had to be told, because the war that created it should never have happened. But it did happen. And when it did, a 14-year-old girl with braids picked up a gun and fought back. That is not heroism. That is humanity under impossible pressure. That is what ordinary people become when evil comes to their door and demands a response. Freddie Oversteegen gave her response. She fought, she killed, she survived, she remembered. And she taught us that resistance sometimes requires us to do terrible things, but it never requires us to stop being human. Her bicycle is silent now. The guns are long since laid down. But the memory of what she did and why she did it remains. A reminder that evil must be resisted, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that the cost of doing those things is something we carry forever. The girl with braids is gone, but her story endures.